Good, I think we can start. Perfect, thanks a lot. Welcome everyone to our professional development session on the potentials and pitfalls of collaborative multinational projects. And today I'm really happy that we have like a really great group of discussants. And I'm going to present the discussants a bit later on, but I just wanted to quickly tell you a bit how the session will be structured. So we'll have different topics that we want to address that you can see here. We'll try to like be short and be good with the time so that we can really address all the topics. Usually I will ask like a question and then people will start answering. And if you have questions in the audience, you can either write in the chat and we'll see if we manage during the discussion, the session to answer your questions, or I'll make sure to keep about 10 minutes at the end of the session so that you can also ask the question then. So just that's always perfect. So yeah, as I said, today we have the chance to have really great people who are here for the session. So we have Hector Carvalho. Maybe you could, yeah, wait, perfect. Hector is an assistant professor in social psychology at Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. His research deals with the formation and maintenance of social hierarchies. He was a graduate student in the group-focused animated project, a cross-European initiative at Bielefeld University in Germany, and he has been involved in several other multinational projects, collecting data in Chile and Germany. Then we also have Kate Block. Maybe you can wave. Great, thanks. Kate just started as an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam after her PhD at the University of British Columbia and a postdoc at NYU. She studies how social and cultural beliefs about our in-group shape our self-concepts, especially in respect to gender roles. She's one of the coordinators of the Yukon Project, a collection of psychologists that collected data in 49 countries to examine the role of cultures in men's roles. Then we have Nicholas Coles. Maybe you can wave too. Yeah, great, thank you. Nicholas is a research scientist at Stanford University and is the director of the Psychological Science Accelerator, a globally distributed network of researchers that pool resources to accelerate the accumulation of reliable and generalizable knowledge in psychological science. And he has developed and coordinated approximately half a dozen multinational projects. And then we have Tabea Hessler. Tabea is a senior researcher at the University of Zurich. She initiated the Zurich Intergroup Project, which is a multinational project involving 43 people around the world. And she studies intergroup contact and social change processes in a lot of different contexts. And I'm myself, Leila Eisner. I am a researcher in social psychology. I did my PhD in Switzerland. And I studied political science and survey methods before doing my PhD, and that's why with Tabea we thought why it would be nice to discuss multinational project in our field in psychology and how it has developed in the past years. And maybe I can directly start by letting the discussant talk and intervene during this session. So. I think we all know that, well, if you're here, you're probably already interested in multinational projects, or maybe you're thinking about joining one or starting one, or maybe you're interested in that. And so maybe I can start with a very simple question to Nicholas. Why do you think we should conduct multinational projects?
Thanks, and thanks everyone for being here. So I think there's two main reasons that I think we're engaging in this type of work. And the first one is that psychology is complex. And it's interesting that when we start our training as social and personality psychologists, that the first thing that we're taught is like, oh yeah, behavior is the result of a very complicated mix of social and personality factors, et cetera, et cetera. And then we immediately go into our lab and run 2-cell designs in an extremely constrained experimental setting. Knowing full well that the world is more complicated than we've captured but that we lack the resources to actually capture that complexity. And so I think there's this realization in a lot of subfields of psychology that the questions that we seek answers to are too complicated and require too many resources for an individual group of researchers to actually tackle. And so I think one of the reasons why we're seeing these multinational collaborations is simply that people want to tackle bigger questions. They want to seek a more complex understanding of psychology and realize that they have to pool the resources to do so. So that's sort of the first stream, I think, is that there's this complex truth that we're after, and we need more resources to try to capture it. The second one, which I think is also related, is in addition to truth being complex, the methods that we use to try to uncover truth are also complicated. We have learned through this sort of emerging field of metascience that differences in how we design our studies matter. You can design 5 different studies to tackle the same hypothesis, and they will give you slightly different results. Sometimes they'll even give you conflicting results. We know that the way that we measure our constructs matter. You can give people 5 different subjective well-being measures and see that that subjective well-being measure correlates slightly different with personality measures, depending on which measure you use. We know that the regions that we study matter. We see that there are some findings that are extremely replicable in the US and then not very replicable in other world regions. We see cross-cultural differences in behavior. And so we're seeking complex truths and we're using experimental methods where we know that we're selecting something that's somewhat idiosyncratic and that different methods might yield different results. And that addition and accumulation of seeking complex truths using complex methods, I think is, in my opinion, one of the underlying rationales for trying to pool our resources in these international studies. And so I'll let some other people chime in now.
But then maybe I lead over to why I started multinational projects. So our project started really, really small. There was a seed money call from Switzerland to start collaborations with Chile, where I did already my master thesis. And I thought it was a really great opportunity to also follow up the collaboration I already had and to extend it. This money gave us an opportunity to have a small workshop in Zurich with 10 people. And all of them were really interested. First, we wanted to get their input, but then they saw the project was cool, really collecting data in several countries. And then after that, I just reached out to multiple researchers. We ended up being 43 researchers from 23 countries, collecting quite a diverse data set, both in the LGBT context and in the ethnic context, looking at majority and minority groups. What I think was one of the reasons I thought it's really nice to work together instead of against each other, to really also use this knowledge that different people bring in the field, also people from other countries, how do they perceive phenomena, different expertise and methods that people bring. I think that's something really, really stimulating that can help all of us. And for me, it was also something where I could learn a lot, seeing those differences. I think the data set for the first steps, we looked more at findings across countries, and now we're really diving into also the differences between countries to see how does the legal situation affect LGBT people over the world. We have Russia, where the legal situation has really worsened over the last years. At the same time, we have data from the Netherlands, which was the first country to really legalize same-sex marriage. And the same in the ethnic context, we really have a range of different groups. And I think that makes it really interesting to see where do we find similarities and where do we find differences across countries.
Great, thank you very much for your great answers. Maybe we can continue a bit on these topics if we still have a bit of time. Kate, what motivated you to join, and why did you participate in the multinational project, like you've been involved, or in the UCOM project? And maybe we can hear a bit what you think about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the others, because I think our motivation was kind of a combination of the two. I think, our project was specifically looking at gender roles and attitudes and beliefs around those across cultures. And I think, in the gender literature, it's really, really accepted that social norms and kind of cultural beliefs shape gender roles, but there's very little research that actually looks at that at a very large scale. You know, there's lots of research, really great research comparing a few cultures, but there was much less research comparing a large number of cultures. So I think for us, the motivation was, you know, if social psychology really is the study of how being part of social groups shapes us, then we need to look at people who are part of different kinds of social structures. So that's how we really got to the point of wanting to collect data from a large number of countries. So I think our project is maybe a little bit different than, for example, the Psych Accelerator, in that we had like specific kind of research questions that we went into and designed a broad survey for, and then had the goal to really collect a large data set. So it kind of combines those motivations that we've heard about.
Thanks a lot for your answer. I think we have just a bit of time for Hector to maybe also say what you think and yeah, why you think we should conduct multinational projects. A few couple of words.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what my colleagues just said. Yeah, I want to mention the value of trying to tackle the problem of the overrepresentation of the so-called weird samples in psychological research. I mean, we know because of many kind of structural reasons, resources and history of the discipline itself, that the United States and Western Europe has dominated the research since its creation. And the problem of underrepresentation of countries outside of the so-called Western world, it's huge for understanding what is really happening in our psychology. And so the simple fact that when you prepare a multinational project, you might be able to even question whether the phenomenon you are studying is something that can go beyond the typical samples, is something that has value itself. And of course, it's a huge challenge how to get involved with countries with different languages and the different kind of structure for that collection and so on. But I think this is something that we need to consider kind of as a value in itself.
Great, thank you very much. I think there was a lot of very great insights. And I hope that the people who are in the audience are at least convinced or interested in the idea of multinational projects. And I think that now, well, that we've been talking about why we should conduct these projects, we can dig a bit deeper and say that, well, there are many multinational projects, there are more and more of them, especially in the past years. And I've, for example, been involved in in a couple of different multinational projects. And for me, what struck me was always that the leading style and the coordination in the project was always very different. I think there are lots of different structure. It's almost like small political systems and power structure where it really works differently. And so I thought it would be great if some of you could, well, mention a bit how your multinational project or the one you've been involved in are structured, and who is leading the project and how it works. And maybe we can start with Kate.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a hard decision for us to kind of structure at the beginning and decide how to structure things. I think for us, it was sort of the question of whether we'd have like a very small central team that would kind of take over most of the decisions at the beginning, or start out with a larger team, which would make it more complicated but have more input. So we decided to go kind of the route of the more large team at the beginning. So we are actually 3 teams from 3 universities in 3 countries. They were led by Dr. Tony Schmader at the University of British Columbia, who I worked with at the time, Dr. Colette van der Laar at KU Leuven in Belgium, and then Sarah Martini at the Arctic University in Norway. So each of these had a team, and we all got together each of them had like a grad student and a postdoc, and we kind of built like a kind of fairly large core team of 9 people, where we really made all the decisions and the sort of brainstorming of research questions, designing the questionnaires, deciding on our methods, and so on, together in the beginning before we recruited other people who would be part of the study and collect data and be part of the papers, and eventually we'll also have access to the data to analyze. So my role specifically was the project coordinator along with 2 other grad students at the time. So we kind of started in very much having sort of our own piece of the study, being responsible for certain things, but also really going into the study with our own research questions that very much matched our own research agenda. So that was sort of the structure that we had decided on in the beginning. But ever since then, I've also become part of other cross-national projects where I've taken sort of more of a backseat and more of a collaborator role rather than their leadership role. And yeah, you're right, there's so many different ways to do it. And there's definitely good and bad things about each way that you can kind of decide to do it. So yeah, it'll be exciting to hear from the rest.
Yeah, maybe Nicholas, you could, I know your project is working in a very different way maybe, and so it would be great to hear a bit how it's organized and with leading or how the project works.
Yeah, first I want to kind of acknowledge it. Kate, I think that's such an excellent point about how there's a lot of differences in how these things are structured. And I've often kind of, really like that analogy as well, as like, yeah, governments and societies are structured differently, and so are collaborations. And I think that can sometimes be almost like a relief to hear when people are starting up these collaborations, because they'll be like, oh, but we developed a collaboration where everyone sort of has equal input and things are moving slowly, but it's sort of a consensus-based design. And I say, yeah, that's really awesome. That's actually a model that the Mini Babies Consortium uses, which is an infant development multinational project. And so I think it's, at the beginning, it's really about like, what are the goals of your project? And some of the collaborations that I've been involved in, such as the Many Smiles collaboration, that was an adversarial test of emotion embodiment. And so there, it was really important to get a consensus design, because we knew that we had people with differing views and really wanted to further the debate. So that had a more flat hierarchy to it. Whereas some of my other projects have a very strict hierarchy where it's 3 people really calling the shots and everyone else is sort of playing a more supportive role. And so I think sort of the first step to doing any of these collaborations is to figure out what sort of structure fits the goals of your project, and then just communicate that structure very clearly to people. Some people want to be in a sort of consensus design environment where they have a lot of input. Other people say, I really just have a little bit of lab space sitting around right now, so I really just want to contribute to data collection and maybe help with analysis a little bit. And so I always say, figure out your governing structure and then communicate that governing structure to potential collaborators. And then they, if it's a good fit for them, they'll join and work on your project. So that's sort of my broad answer. I think a lot of people are particularly more curious about how the Psychological Science Accelerator selects and manages studies. And so for those who are unaware, the Psychological Science Accelerator is a standing global international collaboration, in the sense that we just, that's sort of what we do. We just keep running more and more of these studies because we find them really exciting and really important. And the way that those studies are typically selected is through a democratic process. And so anyone in the world can submit a proposal to engage in a PSA study. And then we typically have volunteers who are reviewing these proposals. And what they're reviewing is a couple of things. First, they just want to check feasibility. There's definitely some studies that we can't run. Some people have proposed very intensive behavioral interventions for hard to reach populations. And as big as our network is, we can't do that. Oftentimes we're also just looking, do we think the network will be interested in this study? Do we think it'll be an important study? But after they meet that initial sort of feasibility check, we democratically select the studies. And then typically they're led by the study proposers, who then have a lot of say over how they want to structure it. So sometimes we see this sort of consensus-based design, sometimes we see a more hierarchical structure. And then what the Psychological Science Accelerator does along the way is we offer support. So we're all volunteers who have a lot of experience doing this kind of work. We find it really exciting. We've learned a lot of lessons in a very hard way. And so we offer support, with little things like, hey, here's how you should manage your data. Here's how you can recruit collaborators. Here are some of the bare minimum rules that your collaborators are going to expect if they're participating in a Psychological Science Accelerator study. So that's typically how recruitment works for us. There's also some exceptions. If people want to give us money, If a grant funder wants to give us money to do a specific study, we also do that. So if you know grant funders who want to give us money to do things, we are more than happy to accept that money.
Thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, I think that's all really great points, and I think that's really important to also emphasize that there are many ways to do a project, and each of the ways has advantages and disadvantages, and that's something that has to be considered before starting the project. I think maybe moving on to the next topic, we still have just a couple of, not a bit, like 1-2 minutes to discuss a bit more this topic. And I thought maybe it would be great to also hear about what Hector and Tabea think about the topic. So maybe you could just say a few words and then we can move on to the next section.
Yeah, one point I wanted to add concerning the governance structure is it's kind of more specific and has to do with the role that young researchers might play, because I mean, here in this session we have the opportunity to talk about projects that have been actually led by very young people in the early stage of the career, but this is not often the case, or well, maybe it is changing, but I do want to say that for those who are in grad school, for instance, and are joining a project, it's very important that they know exactly what kind of commitment they are taking, because this can be a lot of work, especially if you're involved in coordination and management. And most of that work has not a direct reward in the typically expected way in the academic career. Like, I mean, managing is not going to give you more publications, for instance, and this can be very taxing in your career. On the other hand, you do develop skills which might be very valuable later on in your career, or even if you want a career outside of academia, like large-scale project management, or leadership skills in intercultural settings. I mean, but the point is that it's important for early career scholars to really know what they are getting their hands on. Probably it's good for the governance structure to find a way of protecting those early career scholars, especially in terms of early publications and things like that, because sometimes it takes years to get some of the project off the ground, and then for a grad student it might be just too late to wait like 3 or 4 years for a publication. So these are things that probably are better off if we consider from the beginning we design a way for young scholars to get involved, but somehow protecting their careers.
Yeah, maybe I can add on to this. So I started, our project started when I was really in the beginning of my PhD. So I think we started end of 2015, then we had the data collection 2016. And I mean, the first publication came out 2020. I mean, it's a high publication, but it just takes a very long time. And also for me, it was tons of time that people, I think, very often are not aware of, just coordinating for the researchers while doing the other things. Also learning how to do statistics, really using those complex data set. And then also for the second step of the project, we decided that the first 2 publications were led by the Zurich team. And then we were like, okay, now we really want that everyone can take a lead. Also really deciding that we would step a little bit out of it. And of course, maybe strategically, it would have been smarter for me to just use the data published, but we said, okay, we wanted to really be collaborative. We really want to empower other junior scholars to take the lead, also people from underrepresented countries, but it's something that is maybe not yet valued in our discipline enough. So also there, it's a very long time process. I'm also involved in other 3 multinational projects, and also their data has been collected 2015, 16, and none of the data has been published so far. So it's just something that I think a lot of people are not aware of. Also the time that is really put into this project from the people behind the scene. And again, if we really say we want to make it more collaborative, we want to get people on board, and we also want to give people the opportunity to use this data set to publish with it, it just, again, extends the time. But I think it's definitely worth it. So I think also there, maybe when recruiting people, we should take things like this into consideration, because of course, if I simply just on MTurk, I will get the data within 1 week or 2 weeks. If I do multinational projects, the data collection can take more than 1 year. And again, the question is also, what do we really value? And I think with that, I'm handing back to Leila.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that's the really great points. And I think as Tabea mentioned, and Hector, I mean, I think everyone mentioned that it's a lot of work, it's a lot of things to consider. And it's especially a lot of work when you think of all the methodological decisions and the difference. Nicholas, you wanted to say something?
I didn't want to interrupt you. Sorry. Okay. But I put it in the chat, but I just kind of wanted to also make it explicit for the people who later view the recording. We found that these tasks, these unique tasks that are required in order to execute one of these large international studies has been really useful for people who are in PhD programs but want to go into industry. And so the PSA, trains project managers all the time. And of course, you walk into an interview and they're like, hey, do you have any experience collaborating with people? And you say, yeah, I collaborated on a project with 500 people and I had to manage it. And they say, okay, no more questions. It's a really unique experience. You become an expert at collaboration and coordination. So I just want to pitch that, with the knowledge that a lot of people aren't interested in a traditional academic route and do want to go into industry. And I think that these large-scale collaborations are actually perhaps a bit more representative of the skills that help people thrive in industry.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think that there are a lot of skills and also just methodological things and decisions and that are involved in multinational projects. You're really involved in all the steps of the research, and I think that's a key thing. And you of course learn a lot, I think, from it. And moving on to the next topic, which is exactly what we've been talking about already, is maybe what are for you the key methodological decisions? I know we've been talking about them, but was not super specific. So I would be curious to hear what do you think are the key decisions that must be considered in a multinational project? And I mean, we can start with Hector.
Well, I mean, there are so many things to talk about. I'm just mention three of them. The first is of course sampling. The whole thing about multinational collaboration is how you build your sample, and maybe face value, you might think that more is always better, but this is actually not the case necessarily. And in this case, I mean, I will kind of follow like the most classical advice probably every one of us has received in science, which is do go back to your research question and then build a sample that is the best suited to answering that question. Do not get tempted by, okay, maybe we can add another country or we can add another, which is actually not adding value, but adding problems. I mean, that might be very often the case, and not just problems in the sense of logistic problems, which are very common problems, but also in the sense that you might be overrepresenting some kind of people in your sample and then underrepresenting some other kind of people. And I will also say, try to aim for a sample that is definitely challenging your hypothesis, kind of make it hard for you to test what you want to test. So once you have proven it, you do have very strong evidence to do it. If you want to test like the cross-cultural validity of, I don't know, like a personality theory, do go to find a sample which you will expect that because of cultural reasons are not replicated the same structures you will normally find in the samples in which the theory was originally developed, like as I said before, like weird samples or student samples and things like that. I mean, we do know that indigenous people from Bolivia do not answer to the big 5 personality questionnaires in the same way than urban samples in South America will do, like educated people in South America, you know. So this is the kind of issue you tackle with multinational sampling, that to go to culture, to other spaces in which your theoretical models are going to be challenged. So that probably is kind of the way to go, I would say. Second point I want to mention more. Doing that, of course, requires a lot of work on cross-validity of your instruments, the way you're measuring, and this is super challenging. And it's not only a matter of translation, which is kind of the starting point, but it's kind of the way in which you make measures that are culturally sensitive, that tackle issues in a way that is relevant for the specific context. And this is not only about like super specific questions or topics, but even in simple things that we are doing kind of every day. For instance, in one of the projects I was involved, it was about prejudice research, and we had kind of these scales about prejudice that have been used for 50 years. But then in some countries, the kind of questions you have in a normal prejudice scales are just too sensitive. I mean, and people think that the items are offensive. So you need to adapt them to the culture if you want the people to complete the service. Otherwise, they will just stop after reading those sentences because they think they are kind of too offensive, you know, which was the case, for instance, one of our projects when we had this gay prejudice items in France, you know. I mean, there was no way that we could use the typical items that we're using in any other country in France because they were more sensitive about it, you know. Yeah, and the final point I want to make is about the analytic plan. I mean, and this is super complex because when you go in this kind of project, there are so many decisions that have to be taken. And I think it's very important that you have a sound analytical plan beforehand, and ideally that you pre-register that plan. And that plan should also include how are you going to address kind of more exploratory research, because with such a complex data set, is so easy that to kind of detour and then you get creative and find other ways to look at the data, and that might be very interesting. But if you don't have clear rules from the beginning that are not biased by the possibility of just finding something else, you might get trapped in I mean, even kind of in practices that now we want to avoid, you know. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Hector. I think you mentioned a lot of very important points. And I think maybe if Kate, if you have something to add on to that, you can go on, and then I think we'll move to the next topic.
Yeah, maybe I can just briefly kind of elaborate how, like, you know, we had fairly similar issues. And I think for us, there was a few things that are really important. So first of all, we spent quite a lot of time piloting at the beginning to really make sure to test in several countries how our measures performed before rolling out to our whole like 125 collaborators. Pre-registration was a huge issue for us as well. We really kind of decided that we wanted to pre-register really in detail how we clean the data and what our hypotheses is, because we think, you know, we have a fairly big data set, so there is the danger of a phishing expedition. We really wanted to make sure that we hold ourselves to not doing that. So I think our solution to that was sort of doing a two-step pre-registration. So we have like a specific pre-registration, how we are going to clean the data, deciding, you know, who to include, who to exclude, how to code certain things, how to evaluate reliability across countries with like multi-level factor analysis was like a huge topic that took a long time. And I think that's actually really important and sort of overlooked in some cross-national research, that, you know, there is these techniques to really do really good statistical tests of how well our measures are holding up, but they're pretty stringent. So it's kind of the decision of whether you want to do that. And so we have sort of, or more specific hypotheses testing is sort of separate pre-registrations, where we have a number of projects that use the data that each pre-register their hypotheses and very clearly specify how they're going to analyze that. One of the things that I think came up for all of us was the issue of control variables. And I think, you know, in the cross-national context, that became very important, because there's a number of cultural and economic factors that are just so highly confounded at the country level. For example, things like collectivism and what we call development. I'll put that in quotation marks. There's definitely some issues with that definition. For us, you know, because our questions were specifically about cultural correlates of gender roles, it became really important to think theoretically of like, what do we want to control for? So I think that's definitely something to really think about when you're writing your pre-registrations, is like, you know, what are the confounds at the country level of these cultural variables and how you want to deal with that. And it was definitely hard. It took us a long time. So that was a big time sink for us.
Thank you, Kate. I think that were really important to also mention that, and all these difficulties are like things you had to consider during the project, and you still have to consider now. Yeah, and maybe now we can move to the next topic, because I think it's really important. So yeah, when we think about multinational project, we're already thinking about including different countries in the project and different groups of people. And I think that for me, it was really important to also know from all of you in the discussion what you considered before starting in terms of diversity, before starting your project. Like what were the things you were thinking about for addressing diversity, and also how to make sure that different countries are included, and also how to make sure different scholars also have a role in your project. And maybe you can start with Tabea.
Thank you very much, Leila. So as I said, our project really started with this seed money call, where we had the team in Zurich and then in Chile. And then we brought some people together for an initial workshop. It was mostly people that Johannes knew, Roberto knew. So it was really a core of like 10 scholars. And then after that, what we really I tried to reach out to people I knew somehow in different countries. And as you know, I was at the beginning of my PhD. So we have a clear underrepresentation of people from Asia. We had at the beginning someone from South Africa or African countries. Even though we extended the whole project by 3 months, in the end, we didn't get the data. So in the end, we don't have anyone from Africa, which I think is something I really would like to change for the next project. Again, also there. Then another challenge that I really found at the beginning was first for me being a PhD student dealing with like 20 professors and seeing where is my role, and yeah, also then taking the lead and saying, okay, I have some expertise that maybe some of them don't have, but at the beginning it can be a little bit intimidating. Then also within the collaboration, what I found at the beginning is that certain scholars from countries that are maybe more underrepresented, and it's not only being from outside the US and from outside of Europe, but also in Europe, if we look at Southern European countries and Eastern European countries, we had some scholars that were really resisting adding on the comments. Like we had different rounds of feedback where we really tried to encourage people. And here I found that female scholars, younger scholars, and scholars from underrepresented countries were at the beginning really, really quiet. I was lucky that I saw many of them at different conferences, and I really talked to them and I told them, hey, it's important, your voice really brings additional value and you can contribute. But there's also something where I think the project leader really have to people and also young scholars encourage them to give feedback, because there's so much pressure that people think professors can give feedback, but maybe not the younger people or not the people in countries that are less represented. So I think it's something where we really also have to see how do we increase diversity there. And then with the follow-up projects, we really set a clear norm that we said, okay, we would like that younger scholars, female scholars, and underrepresented scholars take leads. So also they're saying, hey, we don't want it. It's only the professors that are now the leaders of the follow-up projects, but maybe also come here in the backseat and give people the opportunity to lead that have been less visible or less seen so far. I think what would be good, and that's something we could maybe do less because we didn't have the funding, is to really also implement some training session where people could get trained to really run those analyses. Also really complement people's skills by saying we have someone who's really good in statistics who can maybe give advice and just also answer some questions that people have. I think one big strength of our project was that we had 3 different workshops in Zurich where we got funding via the Swiss agency to really also pay for the travel costs. And again, here, I think particularly younger scholars and scholars from certain countries with less economic resources, it's important to give them the opportunity to come and to try to find funding and resources to really pay also for the expensive, because otherwise only people that have already the funding can take part and really have also this personal interaction. So I think also there's something missing, that we really can get money really easy to maybe really stimulate also this exchange, which I think is really, really important. And maybe last but not least, we said that there's projects with really different leading styles. And I participated in 5 of them. And I think what is sometimes missing, what we could do better in the future, is to really clearly communicate what we're expecting. What is the role of people? Like I had projects where it was basically just one team of researchers. And since 3 years, I haven't heard anything. And other projects are really very more inclusive and trying to involve people in all the different steps. And again, I think there's not a right or wrong, but I think it should be really communicated so that people have clear expectation. What are they signing up for? Do they really have the chance to also lead a follow-up project, or is that not in the scope of the project?
Thank you, Tabea, for this great points. I think maybe we could move on and maybe Hector, I don't know if you have something to add to these questions, since you have also a lot of experience in these projects.
Yeah, I would say that when it comes to diversity, it has to be by design. I mean, you cannot expect that if you just move things are going to fall in the right place, because I mean the structural barriers that are limiting the development of people come from different minorities are also going to be part of your project and of the funding structure, and the language barriers and access to training and so on are going to be present always there, even if researchers leading the team have the best intentions. So you do have to design the way of dealing with inclusion, diversity, and in both at the team level and at the sample level. And of course, the more excluded is the group you are thinking about, the less likely is that they will have the means to fully join a project. So, I mean, Tabea's examples concerning African researchers is just kind of summarizing all of what I'm saying, you know. And I just one additional point, I do think that that one should be especially sensitive, careful about diversity in the dimensions that are connected to the research questions. I mean, because when you do multinational research on topics which are very sensitive, you do need to have kind of the point of view of those who are directly involved in the topic, and that might vary a lot from country to country or society to society. So I would encourage to have kind of very strong design on diversity management within the teams as well.
Thank you, Hector. We have, I don't know if Nicholas or Kate want to add something on this point. Otherwise, we'll move to the final part. Yes, Kate.
Yeah, I guess, one thing that I think I just wanted to kind of emphasize is like really, being at sort of a privileged position at a Western university, the ability to get funding is huge. And, if I did it again, I think I would try to get funding earlier on. We got funding eventually. I wrote a grant with my supervisor at the time, but getting funding early on is really what would have helped us to get a more diverse sample. We had sort of a similar problem. We ended up, we really in the beginning tried to get samples from the African continent. We ended up with a couple, but a lot of people really ran into structural barriers that could have been solved by money. So, not to put, all the onus on like the grad student who spearheads such a project, but, being sort of a Western researcher involved in like a bigger collaboration like that, if there is any way to get money and support other countries, I think that's a good way to help.
Thank you, Kate. And I think I will lead to the next part. And Nicholas, maybe if you want to add something on the topic, you can also add it there. I think you all have so much experience now on this project, and I think maybe some people in the audience would love to hear your experience, and also maybe what's looking back at the projects or what you've been involved in, to know a bit what would you have done differently? What did you learn from your project, and what did you think like afterward, maybe I should have done that differently? And maybe we can start with Nicholas.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I would advise people is to form a collaboration agreement. Let people know exactly what you anticipate their role to be and what you anticipate the end product to look like. And this doesn't have to be a static document. And I think that can be something that can hold people back. They say, okay, well, I'm bringing on these 2 people. The project is still very much in an early stage. I think that's okay. I think what's important is to explicitly communicate with people that, okay, here's our preliminary collaboration agreement. We'll just include right at the top that we're going to change this as we go. And you can include, some ways of transparently documenting changes to that collaboration agreement. And so that's what I would recommend right off the bat, because you'd be surprised that, sometimes people really don't know what their role is. And they don't quite know, whether they should be, responsible for ensuring that, all the emails are going out to collaborators. And so making that explicit at the beginning and forming an agreement that everyone can look at, I think is really important. The second thing that I would recommend to everyone is to, if possible, centralize your data collection effort. And there have been many horror stories in the history of big team science where people had 50 different Qualtrics links for each data collection lab. And for some reason, the variable names got messed up, or if anyone's used Qualtrics, that sometimes it likes to just renumber your scales for you and not show you that it's doing it, but suddenly a 1 to 7 scale is now an 80 to 87 scale. And so that can be a logistical nightmare to try to check all those Qualtrics surveys. And if you need to make a single change, maybe a reviewer says, oh, can you please just add this one question? You're now adding it to 50 different surveys. And so if you have a sort of study design that's amenable to a centralized data collection strategy, do so. And also know that a lot of the tools that you're using, you might think that you can't centralize your data collection effort with a single tool, but you can. So there is a way of collecting data at a bunch of different sites and customizing the survey to different sites using a tool like Qualtrics or using a tool like FormR. This technical solution exists. You just have to look for it or develop it. And so those would be my 2 main recommendations: form collaboration agreements and update them throughout the life cycle of the project as necessary, and centralize your data collection.
Thanks. Thanks for these great, I think, advices. I think, well, now all of the three remaining people in the discussion, maybe you can just unmute yourself and then say what would be your recommendation or what you would have done differently. Yeah.
So maybe then I follow up. I also really agree that it's important to outline responsibilities. And again, also there as a PhD student, maybe you're not aware of the time it takes. So also there, maybe people with a little bit more expertise have to sometimes step in. Like I definitely didn't expect all the time I had to put, particularly in the end of the deadline. I spent many nights, many weekends running this projects, and sometimes until 4 in the morning. And it was really, really tiring. So also there, really maybe protect sometimes junior scholars and really tell them how much work it is. Again, I think also there really be transparent if people are just passive data collector, if they're more actively involved, and maybe also asked if you have the capability to really see what are people looking for, so that there's not frustration. I think there was a workshop on multinational project, and some of the international scholars raised the concern that they felt like they're just always the passive data collection, but they're not taking anything out of it besides that. And I think that's something we should be aware of and maybe change in the future. Yeah, again, and also be sensitive of cultural differences. I think also in terms of deadlines, there's different standards. A deadline in Germany and Switzerland is maybe more strict than in other countries. So also there, maybe have a little bit of buffer and try to really adjust for that too. And something that I realized with a lot of multinational projects and also talking to different professors and junior scholars in many countries is that very often people are intimidated if you're working with really many researchers. And I think it's maybe that they see the work really critical. They might see, be kind of destroy the work. And I think that is not the case. Honestly, working with so many scholars, very often their feedback was very resource. Maybe also because of that, we had a lot of rounds of feedback before submitting. So our review process was rather smooth. Even for really big journals, we got minor reviews. So also there really see the collective as a resource, don't see it as a threat, and really try to actively reach out for feedback. And yeah, I think finally, for me, the multinational project was really a chance to make friends all over the world and to really work with them and learn from them. So I think also there, there's much that we can learn working with other people. And I think very often we can complement our resources because everyone brings different expertise. Is it statistic? Is it project leading? Is it writing? Is it having very specific knowledge about the cultural background? And I think that's something that we can all benefit from.
Yeah, thank you, Tabi. I want to make sure we have time for questions too. So maybe Hector and Kate could like move on and say briefly what would be their recommendations.
Yeah, very briefly. I just want to mention that at least twice I had to face the problem that when publishing, reviewers in the journals were asking us to remove some of the countries from our analysis because of the data quality. For instance, in one case in which we had 8 European countries, we had to remove 4 of them because the missingness was too high in some of the key variables. And of course, the remaining countries were UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and France. And those who were left out were the Southern and Eastern European countries. And in another project, the Chilean sample that I collected had to be left out because, according to the reviewers, Chile was an outlier in the Gini index, the inequality index. But that was only the case because most of the countries were European, in which the Gini index is actually much lower. But if there would be like many African or many Latin American countries, Chile would not be an outlier. So if I will do it again, I mean, I was younger, I didn't feel like doing it, but I think I will fight the reviewers back concerning, I mean, you might tolerate some difference in quality of your data if you are actually sampling countries which are under the radar.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think people already said so many great things, so I don't know how much I have to add, other than, I think it is, in many ways it is worth it to do such big projects. And especially I think it's worth it for furthering our knowledge of the field, because really these kinds of projects can answer questions in a way that, single studies at single locations really can't. So if you're, somebody who's currently thinking about a project like that, I would recommend, think whether you have sort of the time, money, energy, resources to kind of dedicate. But if you do, I think it is worth it. My tip would be to get money early on to make it possibly time, energy, money-wise for you to do those things. Because with funding, for example, you can get administrative support, so you don't have to have your grad student or your postdoc do all of the little kind of menial tasks that are, taking Tabea till 4 a.m. every weekend, staying up and so on. And it also allows you to kind of do sort of things like events like Tabea, for example, did, that bring the scholars together. So, we're trying to do that with the UCOM data because we have this broad data set where there's really a number of questions that people could still test on. And we've had the same kind of issue. We've offered people the possibility to pre-register their own hypotheses on the data set. And so far, no kind of junior underrepresented country or so on, people have taken that opportunity. So I think there is still lots of opportunity to create spaces. But again, you need funding often to do that, because I think it's also not 100% a good idea to kind of run everything on volunteer power, especially if there is some volunteers putting in like 50 hours a week. So yeah, so I would say do it and just make sure that you kind of support all the people that are part of it.
Thank you. That was a perfect wrap up and take home message, I think. Yeah, now we have about a bit more than 5 minutes to answer questions. If you have questions, you can either write them in the chat or raise your hand and just unmute yourself. And then if you have follow-up questions after the session, because it will close at 9, feel free to write in Wova, and we will make sure that we answer all the questions.
I think there's already one question regarding the scale translation, and Nicolas already provided one link. I think I want to add on to that, what we really did is to ask all of our collaborators to translate the scales where translation was not existing. So we had 14 languages. I think it would be a really good practice to also have some back translation. Again, it really depends on the resources that people have. But we found later that sometimes translation were not optimal. So again, also they are really maybe translated into the other language and then also back to really make sure that the maps on. And of course, there's some popular scales where maybe translations are already existing, but also they used some of those translation, and then we were like, oh, they're not adequate anymore, or we have to see. So also there, even if a translation is existing, double check that it's still valuable and that you can use it.
Yeah, and I linked to the PSA policies, which is essentially back translate and then also just test on some native speakers. And sometimes you realize that the translation is technically correct, but like sometimes a little offensive. And so that's been our strategy. I will say though that this to me is a very open research question, whether back translation is actually improving quality and whether it's affecting the psychometric properties of the measure. And so that's a meta-scientific question that many people on the translation committee in the Psychological Science Accelerator are investigating, because it is extremely time intensive to back translate. You're essentially doubling the amount of labor. And so when you're running a study in 20 languages, you've doubled a lot of labor. And so, yeah, so in my opinion, I will say we've tried to develop standards erring on the side of rigor within the Psychological Science Accelerator, but we often have doubts about how necessary it is.
Yeah, I would also like to add that having a scale in a different language is not necessarily enough to run a study with using that scale. I mean, for instance, if you have a scale in Spanish, there's so many branches of Spanish that Chilean Spanish is not the same than Mexican Spanish or whatever. So I would say probably the best is to have a local partner who can check everything. I mean, not always possible, but be aware that translating is not it's not enough, you know.
Yeah, and to make things even a bit more complicated, I think I'll try to sell the idea of kind of a multi-level factor analysis, which really helped us kind of gave us some insights into our data, and that, you know, even if you have a scale that is understandable and sort of each item sort of means the same way, the same thing in each language, doesn't necessarily mean that your measure with like whatever 12 items kind of functions in the same way in different cultures. So I'm hoping to see that more often in cross-cultural research. We made that sort of part of our pre-registration, but there's some trade-offs because it makes it a lot harder to do, and it takes so long, and your computer doesn't like doing those complicated multi-level models. But I think that's another thing that we should be thinking about to really evaluate after we have the data, like how do these measures function?
Thank you very much. I think, yeah, the meeting is almost over. Yeah, again, as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, just write them on Wova and we will reply. As you could already tell right now, like they have the discussant on this panel have a lot of experience and a lot of things to say. So I think really feel free to reach out and see and ask the questions and use this experience. And yeah, and I think I would like use to use this opportunity to just thank you everyone, to thank everyone for like being here during this discussion. At least I've learned a lot during the discussion. I hope it's the same for you. And yes, and thank to the discussant and thanks to everyone. Thank you.